Well, ladies and gentlemen, honorable ministers, assistant ministers, let me welcome you this morning to Botswana. And thank you, John Glassy and your team. I should not forget our able secretaries, their deputies, and at the same time take this opportunity to thank our sponsors, because without them we wouldn't be here. Our supporters from industry. This colorful event wouldn't be if they hadn't come here, because without them, all these colorful IT events wouldn't be happening. Education wouldn't be where it is if they hadn't become part of education. John said I shouldn't be long-winded. Well, I'm a politician and I'm going through primaries. And then he put a microphone in front of me and he gave me a captive audience. It's a risk. And the timing is right, so what can I do? And I've been itching all week to talk to somebody and air my frustrations. So I'm going to try very hard not to be long-winded. But then also, education isn't a subject you can just brush aside. It's a subject you do take seriously, because it is serious business. It is about the future of this continent. It is about the future of the world, whether we like it or not. It is the only thing that's going to take nations out of poverty. It is the one thing that has liberated nations around the world. Because it is education that is going to help us bring peace and order. It is when nations are educated that nations will understand why they must speak to each other and not fight with each other, and maybe talk about peace. So maybe we should spend time talking about education. But education needs enablers, and that's why IT is important. So maybe we do need to spend time talking about education. But education on this continent is a challenge. It's a challenge for many reasons. And before I proceed, the reason I was making those funny signs as I was sitting there about I didn't want to be culprit number one with my cell phone going as I was standing here. So please switch my cell phones off because I don't want them going and whilst I'm talking. And my announcement number 2 to the Botswana media, I do not have a written speech to hand out. So please take your own notes, because there will be no handout when I'm done. And if you want to record, do so, because I will not remember what I said when I'm done. On this continent, we have to worry about the budget. Most African governments that work on grants in the developing world, grants come with conditions. You are told where to spend the money, how much you should spend, and where you should spend it. And when that happens, you have very little choice on how much can go to education and what part of education, and therefore you are controlled. Which is why you can only spend so much on education. And half the time, if the donor says it's going to HIV/AIDS, that's where it's going to go. It will not go to education. But even if you spend in your own money, or when you spend in your own money, there are competing requirements all the time. You have to build roads, you have to build clinics, you have to build other things in the developing world. Or even in the developed world, you always have competition for funds. In Botswana, we have been spending steadily over 20% of the budget, easily up to 27%, sometimes even 30% of the budget over the last 5 years on education. we've been lucky. But this cannot be said for the rest of the continent. But it is clear that you need to spend a certain amount of your budget, a sizable amount of your budget on education, because you need to invest on your human resource to make that part of your economy invested in, to invest in it so that it becomes a workable factor in the future, so that it contributes as much as the roads will contribute in the future, as much as the clinics will contribute in the future, the human resource must contribute in the future. You cannot have education doing anything for you if the facilities, the buildings in which you run education are not developed, if the equipment by which you want to deliver education are not up to standard. If you're using the old Olivetti, where your fingers get caught between the keys, and everybody is using the latest keyboard. I've seen one lately that you roll up and stick in your pocket. You've seen this, the flexible little plastic keyboard that you can roll up and put in your suitcase and travel. If you are still locked up in the old keyboard that you can't take anywhere, you're not going to move too far in education. So equipment matters. The facilities in which you run education matter, if you are going to have education that is going to make any sense to you or to the future. If you're going to compete in education, your facilities have to be up to date, your equipment has to be up to date. The quality of teachers, teacher training. This means the teacher training content, what you teach your teachers, has to be the right thing. The curriculum that you give to the teachers has to be researched to be of the caliber required in modern day teaching. And the teachers themselves have to be prepared to work in modern day standards. But then today, the teacher is also up to their ears in worker rights. Because modern day workers have rights. They are young. They know that they have rights. But somebody has to tell workers that there's also obligation that goes with rights. I will leave that debate there because I have an examination happening and I dare not risk my journalists misunderstanding me. So I'll leave that one hanging. But we cannot talk about rights of teachers and pretend that children do not have rights to learning. Those rights have to be balanced by somebody. And governments have the responsibility to balance those rights somehow. Then there's curriculum development. This comes with research. This is why we have all these experts around us. When we develop curriculum, when we teach, are we teaching what is right? Are we teaching what is relevant? Are we in sync with what our economies require at the time when we teach? Are we responding to what our countries require at any point in time? Or are schools places where we send our children every morning because we're going to work? Are they really daycare centers for our children? Because we need a place to dump them. Because we have somewhere else to go. Or is there a reason why our children are going to school? Is school an extension of a life that we intend to live in the future through our children? Are schools a part of a life we want to live in the future as a nation? As we live in the offices planning our future, do we see schools as part of that future? What I see, schools are places where our children are, or in this continent. Schools have been places where our children have been. We only remember schools when we look for workers. I don't think we've remembered schools as places where our future workers will come from. I hope I'm clear there. Because as a community that looks for workers, if we saw schools as places where we breed future leaders and future workers, we would have stayed away from schools as much as we do, at least in this country. Because parents don't even appear at schools. I don't know well, in this country at least, parents were not going to school until 2-3 years ago. I don't know in other African countries if PTAs exist. I don't know how many parents do go to school to find out what their children are doing. I'll let that one sink, particularly for us ministers. Schools are just places where children go. We look for qualified people, but we don't really know where they came from. But education is about schools. Schools are not buildings. They should be seen as part of a system that produces the people we eventually use. And then we talk about inclusive education. It cannot be inclusive if schools remain distant to the whole picture, this picture that I'm talking about. There are still places on this continent where culture dictates who goes to school. There are still cultures that will dictate whether it should be the boy child or the girl child. There are still religions that cause hesitation about who should progress and who should drop out because they should get married rather than go to school. There are still issues of language on this continent. There are still issues of ethnicity. And if we cannot allow education to cut across all those issues, this continent is not going to cut across these, as far as I'm concerned, culture, gender, religion, language. Those are the little things that help divide this continent. Those are the little words, in my view, that divide us. But if we were to find one word in education that will bring inclusivity to all of us so that we can bring education to all our people on the continent, so that all our people can get education equally, regardless of whether they were male or female, Muslim or Christian, whatever, whether they came from the north or the south. And incidentally, in typical form, I have challenged the latest inclusion to the MDGs of culture. Those that will have heard it there is a proposal to add culture to the MDGs. I have reported to Cabinet here that my proposal is to object as Botswana that culture should not be added to the MDGs. Because the addition of culture as one of the requirements to the other MDGs, the other 8, on this continent, it can only be another obstacle, a divisive element on this continent. Because the minute you say culture in Africa, we are going to spend forever arguing. Because as soon as you say culture, we are going to be asking whose culture, which culture. We are going to be bogged down on ethnicity. But if you were to talk about poverty and words that cut across, if you found a unifying word in education, a word that will cut across the whole continent, then maybe we will make progress. So for the sake of this continent, even in education, I would urge all of us to find a word that will educate the whole continent so that Africa can be educated as one. May I wish this conference to find success, to find the future in education, because it is education eventually that will liberate Africa. I thank you.